let me tell you another story. The Bodhisattva was once born a poor man. When his father died, he supported his mother. Shortly before she died, she forced the Bodhisattva into a marriage against his will. Not long after this, the Bodhisattva decided to renounce the world and live as an ascetic. But when he told his wife she needed to find a job to get her own living, she revealed that she was pregnant and asked him to wait until after his child was born. He agreed. After the birth, the Bodhisattva, again still our Buddha but not yet the Buddha, announced that he was leaving, but his wife asked him to stay until their child was weaned, and again he agreed. But soon after this, she conceived again, and the Bodhisattva knew she would ask him once more to stay behind for his second child. So he fled in the middle of the night without telling her. He tricked the city guards and got out through the main gate and went to the Himalayas. Joyful at having broken his family bonds, leaving love and desire behind, he reached supernatural attainment and was later reborn in heaven. Now, you might have some conflicted opinions about that story from the Buddha's past lives. A modern I that is not so keen to embracing probably some of the gender roles of pre-modern India and South Asia is going to look at some of that story. And, I'm one of these two and go, hold on. If you want to go to the mountains, quit making babies. A different I is going to say this story is about what the Buddha asks you to renounce in order to actually attain enlightenment. This is what the Buddha his teachings are going to require of you if you want to get out of the endless cycle of being born, dying, and being reborn. Because as we will see in this lecture, the Buddha says life promises us all three things: aging, illness, and death. And along the way, we suffer. And why do we suffer? He will say, craving and desire. We suffer because we desire things. We suffer because we crave. And when we do not get them, or even if we do get them and find them unfulfilling, we suffer. Letting go of everything is the only way to attain enlightenment. Let's see what Buddha has to say about this story in his sort of last life before he finally moves on to be reborn, or finally born, or never born again, if you like, in heaven. 30 disciples from the countryside visited the Buddha at his monastery. The next morning, as they did their alms rounds, this is them going around asking for food, going around asking for clothing, the things they need to support themselves, because in the Buddhist tradition, monks are not, strictly speaking, allowed to fend for themselves. They're not allowed to farm, make anything for themselves. All of this has to come freely from a community of believers. They passed a prison and saw thieves and murderers bound in chains and in great misery. They asked the Buddha if there was any bond greater than this. He answered that the bond of craving wealth, food, and family is 1,000 times stronger. And then he told this story to illustrate his point. The Bodhisattva's father, mother, wife, and son were earlier births of the Buddha's father, birth mother, wife, and son. Within this Jataka tale, you actually get quite a lot of what the Buddha has to say. Hopefully, if I do my job right, by the end of this lecture, you will see Buddhism as something that is a simple concept to understand at first, something that is going to sound very difficult to practice, and of course, never when I talk about religion am I compelling anyone to practice anything, but you can think about it, right? And a concept that just gets deeper the more and more you think about it, the more and more upon which you reflect on it. And we will end this by reading some of what the Buddha directly has to say, and some of you will find it interesting, I hope. Let's jump in. So in the last lecture, we ended with the Upanishad texts, which we didn't go over much, but we talked about their introduction of some important concepts to pre-existing Vedic traditions. Those concepts emphasized an inward turn in religion. Rituals are very outward. It's about controlling nature. It's about controlling what happens around you. And hiring somebody, crucially, and in this world, a Brahmin, to handle those rituals for you. And the Upanishad texts came in and they introduced the idea that actually all phenomena had something more to do with what was going on inside you, inside your own heart or mind, if you prefer, and gave the individual a high degree of control over what those things were. They also introduced karma. They also introduced rebirth. Now, at the same time that's going on, we had two other competing traditions. In the Mahabharata, and especially in the Bhagavad Gita, we had the idea that dharma was fate, and that the highest moral good was to follow that fate, even if it made you do things that seemed morally bad. You'll recall the military leader in the Bhagavad Gita, who Krishna calls on to order his armies into battle, probably killing that military leader's own family, which you would think normally is not the morally correct thing to do. But Krishna tells us what's morally correct is following fate. Then we had Jainism, and, I had very little to say about Jainism except that Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, dies when he eventually renounces food and water to try to achieve a level of purity, to try to achieve enlightenment. Now, the Buddha is going to reject all of this. And so the Buddha in this intellectual world is going to be really, really radical. A lot of what he says is going to be sort of founded in part of the Upanishad texts. So you're going to get rebirth, you're going to get karma, you're going to get your ability to not control the world, but reject the world and escape the cycle of rebirth, death, rebirth, death. You can control that inwardly. You don't need anyone to perform a ritual for you to control that. And he's also going to highlight what he calls a middle path. So he's going to reject Jainism and that kind of extreme denial. For him, the whole thing is to meditate. The whole thing is to realize how to best reject everything in the world to escape suffering. And to do that, you need to have at least enough food and water to continue meditation. So what Jainism teaches is also, at least in its extremes, wrong for the Buddha. So he's saying no to a lot of what's going on in this intellectual world. Let's look at his origin story. So you probably know the founder of Buddhism, the Buddha, with a capital B, is Siddhartha Gautama. So he lived from approximately 630 to 550, and of course, hazy question marks among all of our early pre-modern religious leaders, but we'll just run with it. And he is the one who becomes the Buddha, with a capital T and a capital B. But he is not the only Buddha. Buddha simply means the enlightened or awakened one. So if we follow this religion and its ideas appropriately, there have been past Buddhas. There is the Buddha, capital T, capital B, that is Siddhartha. And, he wants everybody to become enlightened or awakened. It's a slow process, but in their own time. This is what he wants everyone to escape. So he wants us all to become Buddhas. So there are many, many Buddhas. There have been past, there will be future, at least within this tradition. The myths versus facts are hard to determine. I think in that case, it's most interesting to just go with the myths. The sources on his life date to several centuries after his death, which is very, very common. We'll see when we go to China that Confucian sources, or sources on Confucius' life, are also way after he's dead and things like that. And they would have been recorded, these sources, by monks and nuns who were already adherents to the Buddhist tradition. The Buddha's goal, as I've already said, all he wants to do is for each individual provide a path to break the cycle of birth, death, rebirth, death, rebirth, death, rebirth. Because all of that for him, all of it, every single thing, is suffering. So Siddhartha was born in the Himalayan mountains in what is now the country of Nepal. His mother had a dream. She dreamed of a white elephant, and this white elephant was holding a lotus flower in its trunk. This seemed like an auspicious dream, so she went ahead and had this dream interpreted for her. The interpreters, hearing this dream, told her that she was either giving birth to a great monarch, a great king or something like that, or a great teacher. Now, so Siddhartha's parents, knowing this, based on this white elephant with the lotus flower dream, raised Siddhartha inside a walled palace. The objective was to protect him from seeing the suffering of the outside world. They didn't want him to see poverty. They didn't want him to see illness. They didn't want to see people getting old. They didn't want to see people dying, people, I don't know, having their hearts broken, any suffering in the world. They tried to keep away from his eyes. Within his walled city, in this place of safety and seclusion, Siddhartha married. As our story says, he had a child. As our story says, he eventually will leave them, as our story says. One day, inside this walled city where he lives, inside his massive palace, he's being pulled along by a chariot, and inside the palace park, he sees three incredible things he's never seen before, that you have seen perhaps before in your life. He sees for the first time, after he's married and already has a kid, an extremely old person, an elderly man. He then sees a sick man, someone who's, bent over and coughing and feels horrible and is suffering in a way that they can't control. Finally, he sees a corpse that's being hauled off for cremation. The sort of shell around him, the protective shell that his parents created in his adult life, cracks and breaks, and he sees the things that he says were all guaranteed: aging, illness, and death. He then goes on in this journey to see a wandering ascetic who looked simple and poor, but happy. Siddhartha is, inside a palace. He's quite wealthy, and yet he feels weird. He's a bit guarded. Something's wrong. He sees all this suffering. It seems bad. And then he sees someone who has nothing, and they seem happy. And from this, he gets inspiration. He decides to find greater happiness by journeying on his own. And this journey is very long. This journey is part of the Jataka tales that we've been talking about. It's all of the ways that he tried to find enlightenment before he finally found his 4 noble truths and his 8-fold path. So he goes around and he's denying himself all kinds of things. Denying himself food, light, water, whatever. He goes around living like these other ascetics in South Asia for 6 years before he finally says this is headed nowhere. He just stops. He doesn't want to starve himself anymore. He doesn't want to make himself very thirsty. He wasn't deny himself whatever it is you imagine he could deny himself. He says there's no answer here. What's going to happen? He stops after the 6 years of this, and he meditates under a Bodhi tree for exactly 49 days. At the end of this 49 days, he emerges from a meditation having gained enlightenment and moving on then from that place to begin teaching others about exactly how it was that he finally gained that enlightenment. As I've already alluded to, the core of Buddhist teaching is the 4 noble truths and the 8-fold path. The Buddha's first sermon was preached to only 5 people in the Ganges River Valley. And in that sermon, he starts to elaborate his difference from the other sort of ascetics and the other sort of spiritual traditions that are floating around in his world. He says there are 2 incorrect routes to knowledge. The first of these is extreme self-denial, so no fasting, nothing like that. The second is extreme self-gratification. So while fasting is bad, living a total, this is a word from a different corner of the earth, but a total hedonistic lifestyle, as much food as you can eat, as much liquor as you consume, as much sex as you can have to try to attain enlightenment, as many hallucinogens as you can consume, all of that is also a waste. That is not going to get you anywhere. He then says that what he's found is a middle path between these two. And that middle path is built on the 4 noble truths. The first of these noble truths teaches us that suffering is an innate part of existence. There is no existence, there is no life on this earth at any scale, insect, plant, animal, human, where suffering is not a part of that existence. Now, built on that, he says suffering is caused by craving and desire. Now, this is a hard pill for some people to swallow, but again, I'm not asking you to be Buddhist, I'm just telling you what he says. Suffering, so not In a certain sense, this is easy. If you suffer because you're not as rich as you would like to be, why are you suffering from that? Because you crave to be rich. That's very understandable. What about suffering when the body fails? You know, the Buddha says we're all guaranteed three things: aging, illness, death. So suffering in the face of aging is suffering because you crave being young, you crave being virile, you crave a certain perhaps athleticism or energy or something like that. And in that way, aging causes you suffering because you crave not aging. Illness is the same thing. So you crave being healthy, you crave your body working, you know, you crave having control of how your body feels. And through that craving, health, declines in your health, illness becomes a problem. So suffering is caused in that way. Death, clinging to this life. The more you cling, the more you crave to this life, the more suffering the concept of your death causes. I mean, the Buddha, there's so much to the Pali Canon, but in many places in the Pali Canon, he'll say, what is your body? At what point is your body you? Pluck out your eye and look at it. Is that eye in your hand you or an eye? If it were possible to just pull your intestines out and look at it, and he gets quite graphic in some stories, look at the sort of, fecal matter inside your intestines and look at the undigested food and the blood and the oozing and the disgustingness, and would you say this foul mess in my hands is me and I'm proud of it and I cling to it? He would say, no, you would be repulsed. There's nothing about the human body. He says, remove the human skin from the human body, and what's so good about it, right? So in that way, even in the face of things that we would all normally agree are suffering caused by something else, aging, entropy, and the body not replacing itself, illness, a disease, death, I don't know what called death, being stabbed, let's say, murder caused your death. He says the actual suffering is not the pain. The suffering is clinging to life, health, and youth. The third noble truth, then, if there is suffering in everyone's life, and suffering comes from craving or desire, then 3, suffering can be overcome by overcoming its causes. Suffering can be overcome by overcoming craving and desire. If you don't desire to be young forever and beautiful, and you recognize that we'd all be hideous if we could take our skin off and hold our guts in our hands, then you don't suffer when you become old. You realize this body is not really part of you, at least in a Buddhist conception. It's not part of the self. It's not part of you. It's something that's going to fail you. You can't control it, so it's not you. Let it fade. And then you are free from the suffering of aging. This goes to logic. Finally, how then do we realize this? How do we overcome craving and desire? We do that with the 4th noble truth, the fact that in Buddhist teachings, the path to overcoming craving and desire is the 8-fold path. Now, that 8-fold path we're not to go into in any real depth. There are some other concepts in Buddhism I want to talk about, mostly the self and things like that. But the 8-fold path includes right view, right intention, right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right thinking, and right sort of awareness, mindfulness, and correct or right meditation. Now, if you follow that 8-fold path, then you can achieve something you've heard of before. You can achieve nirvana. But nirvana here, let's be careful about what that word means. That is not heaven. That is not an afterlife in which you finally get all of the things that you craved in your life, but that cause suffering. Nirvana literally translates as extinction. The cycle ends, and in that way, you are free. So it's not free into something like an Abrahamic heaven or something like that. It's free in the sense that it all ends. This only happens if you have a true understanding, a true enlightenment, a deep as possible as it can be for anyone, the understanding of the 4 noble truths resulting in an end of the cycle of death and rebirth. Now, as I alluded to earlier, this is a major challenge to the Brahmins of the day. It is, in its day at least, an anti-elite philosophy. Why? Because you don't need anything. Anyone can attain enlightenment according to the Buddha. You do need to, in earlier forms of Buddhism, you must ordain as a monk, but anyone is welcome to do that. But once you're a monk, it's on. You can attain enlightenment. The one sort of, we'll mention this again later, but the one sort of caveat here, and a reflection of this sort of patriarchy of the day, is that women cannot. So for a woman to achieve enlightenment, one has to go through one more cycle of death and rebirth, and then be born a man. And as a man, you can then join the monkhood in a full sense, although early monasteries, and even today, allow for nuns within the monastery. Once born a man, you can fully ordain as a monk and then achieve enlightenment. That's not the best part about this religion, and it's something we got to admit. Other things about this I think are at least interesting. So, you have to be a monk. If you're a woman, you have to become a nun so that you can be reborn a man, so that you can become a monk. That's required. You have to dedicate yourself full time to meditation. But even there, you do have, according to early Buddhism, and Buddhism now, some control over how you're born in the next life. So if we go back to who can attain enlightenment, women who are ordained as nuns can become monks, which is a better birth in this logic, and then enlightenment. But even if you don't ordain, you can still do acts of goodwill, especially here donation to the temple and things like that, that will improve your birth in the next life. So for this reason, Buddhism really takes hold in the early days among the sort of merchant classes of South Asia. Because if you're a merchant, what you can do is, you don't have to give up your livelihood, but you can continue donating to temples and things like that, and make sure that you're born better off in the next life until eventually you are in the life where you can become a monk and you can attain enlightenment. The Buddha did some interesting things, especially in light of the photo here on this slide. The Buddha forbade worship of his likeness. You see two of his likenesses here in this slide. So that eventually Buddhists go on to break that. So instead, in the early days, people worshipped at sites important during his lifetime. So for example, when he died, they worshipped at the stupa, a sort of small pointy statue under which he was buried. They would have worshipped at the tree where he was thought to have gained enlightenment, worshipped at places where he was thought to have lectured, that kind of thing. Recent excavations in Lumpini in Nepal have actually found a temple dedicated to the Buddha's mother, built around a Bodhi tree, that same type of tree under which the Buddha meditated to gain enlightenment. And this temple dates to about the 6th century BCE, when the Buddha would have, if the texts are correct, died. So there's no portrayals inside this temple of the Buddha. This is thought then, this temple dedicated to his mother, thought to be a possible place where he is buried. And if it is that place, then it's in keeping with some of the religious practices that he called for, because he's not depicted anywhere. I will say, before I move on from this slide, this is on YouTube for anybody to watch, but its audience is, first and foremost, the audience that keeps food on my table is an audience at a university in metro Atlanta, Georgia. This temple here is a Lao temple, Wat Bodhiputsaram, in southern metropolitan Atlanta. So this is not part of India. This is something you can go see today. For the students watching this, if you know the Interstate 675, if you're headed north on 675, you can see this temple on the left. This is a Lao or Laotian temple. So with that, I think at the top I said we would look at some of the Buddha's texts at the end of the lecture. Let's do it now. Otherwise, the end of the lecture doesn't make sense and it's out of order. All right, friends, this is going to be a little low tech, but it's going to get done. We're going to look at 3 passages from what is called the Dhammapada. This is probably the most famous collection of any sort of sayings or scriptures by the Buddha. There's an entire Pali Canon that is volumes and volumes and volumes of sutras that you do not need to know. I just want to give you a little flavor of what the texts are actually like. Let's start with the first section of the Dhammapada called pairs. And so here we're going to get the sort of causal stuff that the Buddha talks about, how the Buddha thinks that suffering emerges in our lives. Pairs begins, phenomena are preceded by the heart, ruled by the heart, made of the heart. If you speak or act with a corrupted heart, then suffering follows you, as the wheel of the cart, the track of the ox that pulls it. So he's saying, but everything, phenomena. There's no qualification here, just phenomena, everything. It comes after the heart, it's preceded by the heart. It's dominated by, it's governed by, it's controlled by the heart, and it is made of the heart. It comes from the heart in a very serious way. So everything that happens comes from within. So if you are corrupted, if what is within is bad, then suffering will follow you just the way a cart follows around the ox that pulls it. Now that's a big statement right out of the gate. That's immediately saying all of the suffering in your life is coming from within you. It's a hard pill to swallow if you think about, well, this person did bad to me or that person did bad to me and I want revenge. You're going to think, well, that really comes from outside me. The Buddha is going to say, no, it's the wanting of revenge. It's the craving that is the thing you can control. That's the real phenomena. That's the thing you have to get rid of if you want to attain enlightenment. Now, because this begins, of course, as an oral tradition, what we're going to see is as we move through this, it's going to repeat itself quite a bit. So it makes it easier to memorize. The Buddha continues, he says, phenomena are preceded by the heart, ruled by the heart, made of the heart. Nothing new there, he already said it. If you speak or act with a calm, bright heart, then happiness follows you like a shadow. It never leaves. Here we get then, he moves into some examples of what he's saying. He insulted me, hit me, beat me, robbed me. For those who brood on this, hostility isn't stilled. So, stilling hostility, ending hostility, this is where he's saying it's the insult, the hit, the beat, the rob. That's not really what he's pointing at when he says phenomena. What he's pointing at is the hostility that's coming from within that one can control. He then gives us the opposite example. He insulted me, hit me, beat me, robbed me. For those who don't brood on this, hostility is stilled. So it is possible to control hostility, possible to control your reactions to all these things. Hostilities aren't stilled through hostility, regardless. So there's no way, there's no world for him in which you've been wronged and then you achieve revenge and that creates an equilibrium, or that ends hostility. Your revenge will always create more hostility. That's his thinking. Hostilities are stilled through non-hostility. This is, he says, an unending truth. Unlike those who don't realize that we're here on the verge of perishing, those who do, their quarrels are stilled. So he's saying, if you realize that all of life is suffering, that we're here on the verge of perishing, that all we get is aging, illness, and death, that reframes everything. There's no point. There's no point in these arguments. There's no point in, concerning about who insulted, hit, beat, or robbed you. That person will grow old, get sick, and die. You will grow old, get sick, and die. The larger suffering isn't fixed by a fixation on these kinds of things. He says, one who stays focused on the beautiful is unrestrained with the senses, knowing no moderation in food, apathetic, unenergetic. Mara, a sort of devil figure, an evil figure in the Buddhist tradition, overcomes him as the wind a weak tree. So here, again, there's a call for moderation, which we might understand. You need to be moderate in food. You need to be energetic, at least in your Buddhist practice, the Buddha will say. But the first line here is also interesting, to be focused on the beautiful. So even beauty here is passing and not worth your time, not worth your focus, not worth your thought. Beauty needs to be let go of. It's craving that determines what is beautiful and is not. Cut it all out. One who stays focused on the foul. My image from earlier of you standing there holding your own intestines with sort of fecal matter and blood and ooze just coming everywhere. How disgusting our actual bodies are, is restrained with regard to the senses. Knowing moderation in food, full of conviction and energy, Mara, this sort of evil character, does not overcome him as the wind a mountain of rock. So, again, it's focusing on how a good way into this line of thinking is thinking about how gross your body is. You might have someone you love very deeply in a romantic sense, or someone for whom you have a crush or something like that. But then again, you start imagining them without skin on. You start imagining them using the bathroom in a violent way. Not to be crude, but this is sometimes the language of the Buddha. Suddenly it's like, oh, I don't know if that person's that attractive anymore. Not in that moment, at least. But that moment is the truth of life, the Buddha will say. The Buddha here goes on, he who, depraved, devoid of truthfulness and self-control, puts on the ochre robes, the orange or the saffron robes, the robes you associate with a Buddhist monk, doesn't deserve the ochre robes. But he who is free of depravity, endowed with truthfulness and self-control, well established in the precepts, truly deserves the ochre robes. So, can anyone ordain? Technically, yes, but you have to be in the right mindset to be part of the monkhood. Those who regard non-essence as essence, or those who regard something that isn't the truth with a capital T as truth with a capital T, and see essence, truth with a capital T, as non-essence, truth, or fake truth, falsity, whatever, don't get to the essence, ranging about in wrong resolves. So basically he's just saying if you don't understand the truth of everything I've just said, and you don't act on it, then you're never going to find a way out of this trap that we're all set in. But those who know essence as essence and non-essence as non, get to the essence, ranging about in right resolves. So if you know what the truth is, then you're good to go. As rain seeps into an ill-thatched hut, so passion, the undeveloped mind. So he's saying, you really think of your mind and Buddhist practice as building a roof on top of you, building a wall, building a protective barrier around your mind. The Four Noble Truths can be this barrier. And he's saying, if you don't have a firm enough barrier, then passion, which you would normally think of, my God, doesn't everything have to be your passion? Oh, my passion has always been X, and I'm going to live my passion. And then you live your passion, and you find out that you still might get cancer, or you still might, have a loved one die, or you yourself will, whatever happens else, get old, and you will die too, and chasing your passion, what did it matter? It's gone. That kind of passion that you would normally in a Western sense think of as quite good, the Buddha says no. Let go of it. That's craving, that will lead to suffering. And if you can't protect yourself through pursuing a deeper understanding of the Four Noble Truths, then that kind of passion is going to sink back in and become a problem for you. The Buddha goes on, and you should get a sense of why this is called the pairs, because everything is paired. As rain doesn't seep into a well-thatched hut, so passion does not the well-developed mind. Here he grieves hereafter. In both worlds the wrongdoer grieves. He grieves, he's afflicted, seeing the corruption of his deeds. Here he rejoices hereafter. In both worlds the merit maker rejoices, the person who does good. He rejoices, is jubilant, seeing the purity of his deeds. We continue. Here he's tormented hereafter. In both worlds the wrongdoer's tormented. He's tormented at the thought, I've done wrong. He's gone to a bad destination. He's tormented all the more. Here he delights hereafter. In both worlds the merit maker delights. He delights at the thought, I've made merit. I've gone to a good destination. He delights all the more. If he recites many teachings, but heedless man doesn't do what they say, like a cowherd counting the cattle of others, he has no share in the contemplative life. Here the contemplative life is again the monkhood. So he's basically saying, as we saw earlier, there's many possible ways to actually be a sort of fake or disingenuous or corrupt in some way monk. Being a monk alone is not enough to get you anything. If he recites next to nothing, but follows the Dhamma, or the Dharma, as we've seen it spelled, in line with the Dhamma, abandoning passion, aversion, delusion, alert, his mind well released, not clinging, either here or hereafter, he has his share in the contemplative life. So this is very interesting, because I said earlier that this teaching is, for its time and its place, pretty radical. And it's here where you don't have to have, in this last stanza, any particular knowledge. you can know next to nothing and still do the practice correctly and still enjoy the contemplative life and still be among those who are correctly practicing Buddhism. Contra that, in the stanza before, you can be incredibly well educated. You can know everything that you need to know. You can say all the right things. You can behave all the right ways. But if you don't take it seriously, if it's a sham, it gets you nothing. So this you can imagine if you're a Brahmin whose job it is to perform rituals and things and control the outside world and guarantee a better life for people, this is an upsetting passage. Aging. This is a major concept in Buddhism, or rather a major thought tool in Buddhism, because it's something to which we're all subject, as I've tried to emphasize so far. What laughter? Why joy when constantly aflame? That's, again, an excellent way to get into this way of thinking. What is there to laugh about? Why is there any joy to be had in this life, uncontemplative, to reference his earlier phrase, where everything, absolutely everything, is suffering or will lead to suffering? Enveloped in darkness, don't you look for a lamp? If all of life is suffering, don't you want to find some way out? He's asking. Look at the beautified image. A heap of festering wounds shored up. I told you he gets gross. Ill, but the object of many resolves, where there is nothing lasting for sure. So here he's saying that anything beautiful is going to eventually fall apart, and festering wounds is going to give us that sort of physical body thing that he's talking about. Worn out, this body, a nest of diseases, dissolving. This putrid conglomeration is bound to break up, for life is hemmed in with death. We're all guaranteed aging, illness, and death. Again, I said earlier, this is a repetitive message, but the more it repeats, the more you kind of get where he's headed. And you can see again, a putrid conglomeration that is bound to break up is how he values something that most of us would say is us. Most of us would say, this is the self, this is me, I am my body. I have my bike in the wrong, there we go. I have my bike in the background. I like to ride my bike. I like to be fast on my bike. I'm getting old, so I'm not that fast, and I like ice cream, so I'm not that thin or light, but I care about it. I try hard, at least for me, given that I'm, not going to get a racing sponsorship and it's a hobby. And yet even my body, as much as I ride that thing, is a putrid conglomeration bound to break up. Let's move further. On seeing these bones discarded, like gourds in the fall, pigeon gray, what delight. So now it's rotted all the way down to the skeleton, just sitting there in some open field, disgusting gray. What's there to get excited about? A city made of bones, plastered over with flesh and blood, whose hidden treasures are pride and contempt, aging and death. This is what you get for loving the body. Even royal chariots, well embellished, get run down, and so does the body succumb to old age. But the Dhamma of the good doesn't succumb to old age. The good let the civilized know. And this here, and I'm just thinking this now, I've taught this a few times, but just reading it now, this last passage is so interesting. The Dhamma of the good doesn't succumb to old age, and the good let the civilized know, meaning that there's some difference here between what he's considering the good and what he's calling the civilized. So you can imagine civilized must be something about, I have all this knowledge, I have all this wealth, I have all these trappings, I have all this property, I am so beautiful, this, look at me, a paragon of civilization. And yet he's very clear here, that's not good. The good is the Dhamma. He says, this unlistening man matures like an ox. His muscles develop, his discernment not. Even if you never skip leg day, but you don't have the Dhamma, it does not matter. If we keep pressing, again, we're still talking about this passage on aging. He says, through the round of many births I roamed without reward. And you know this because we've read some of the Jataka tales, the tales of his earlier lives. Without rest, seeking the house builder, painful is birth again and again. And here, I will let you know, you see there are some asterisks here, some notes to be had. In these notes is elaborated by the translator in this version of the Dhammapada, which I'm happy to share with you. Even in the YouTube comments, I'm happy to share that with you. Some stranger just asked me. Here we have this vision of the house builder. The house here is taken, at least as is traditionally understood, to be the self. So the house is you. Think earlier where he's talking about a mind with a poorly thatched roof where passions get in. The house builder is you. The house builder is the self. The house builder excuse me, wrong. The house is the self. The house is that which is constantly reborn. The house builder is that system of rebirth. So that if the house is the self, the house is you, the house builder is what keeps building the house back up. And every time it happens, painful is birth again and again. The Buddha says, house builder, you're seen. I have discovered this system. I've discovered the key to escaping death and rebirth and death and rebirth. He says, you'll not build a house again. That's wild. Think about that. You'll not build a house again. The self will not exist again. I will not be born again. That's where he's going. All your rafters broken, the ridgepole dismantled, immersed in dismantling, the mind has attained the end of craving. By dismantling everything about the self, what you want, what you hope to be, what your dreams are, why you feel one way or why you feel another, and realizing that all of this leads to suffering and letting it go, that's the path to sort of take down these rafters, this ridgepole, dismantle all of it, and the house builder does not build the house, and you are not reborn. Okay, last one, passage number 12 from the Dhammapada, self. If you hold yourself dear, then guard yourself well. The wise person would stay awake, nursing himself in any of the 3 watches of the night, the 3 stages of life, youth, middle age, and being old. First, he'd settle himself in what is correct, only then teach others. He wouldn't stain his name. He is wise. So this is very interesting. We've seen you can be a corrupt monk, and you can say all the right things and know a ton of stuff, and it doesn't matter if the practice is wrong. And conversely, if the practice is right, you don't need to be that erudite, you don't need to know all the chants, you can just practice the Dhamma the best you can and still get somewhere. Buddhism is not big on mission work. It travels world historically through merchants, through people settling who are already practicing it. But as you might think of in sort of the spreading of, say, Christianity or Islam, there's no drive like that. It's just about you. It's just about fixing yourself. And, then by example, other people will want to fix themselves. But there is no going out and spreading the good news or something like that. And here we have it. Here this sort of like, be quiet. Don't stain your name. Make sure you understand what you're saying before you say it. Don't waste words, that kind of idea. There's a sort of proscription against mission work and against being haughty and talking all the time about Buddhism, which means I'm not going to make it because here I am talking all the time. If you'd mold yourself, he says, the way you teach others, then, well trained, go ahead and tame. So there are instances where you should teach. I mean, there are monks who give lectures, and that's what they do, and that's what most monks do, is practice Buddhism and share their knowledge with others, but there's a certain level you have to attain, a certain dedication before that's possible. For as they say, what's hard to tame is you, yourself. Your own self is your own mainstay. For who else could your mainstay be? With you yourself well trained, you obtain the mainstay hard to obtain. The evil he himself has done, self-born, self-created, grinds down the dullard as a diamond, a precious stone. When overspread by extreme vice, like a sal tree by a vine, you do to yourself what an enemy would wish. They're easy to do, things of no good, and no use to yourself. What's truly useful and good is truly harder than hard to do. This is sort of, I think anybody can kind of relate to this message. It's all about, any sort of morality kind of has something about self-sacrifice and things like that in it, and we see that here. The teaching of those who live the Dhamma, worthy ones, noble. Whoever maligns it, a dullard, inspired by evil view, bears fruit of his own destruction, like the fruiting of the bamboo. Evil is done, Buddha tells us, by oneself is one defiled. Here again, we get to the idea at the very beginning that all phenomena are, preceded by the heart, come from the heart, ruled by the heart, made by the heart, right? Here, it's coming back again, that evil is done by you. And so you have the ability to end evil. Evil is left undone by oneself. By oneself is one cleansed, so that you have the control. Purity and impurity are one's own doing. Same message. No one purifies another. No other purifies one. So this is a big stab at the sort of Brahmin class that would have lived during this time. The Brahmin class can perform no ritual to help you. Only you can do it. But it's also, again, I mentioned just a moment ago that there's no impetus for mission work in Buddhism. Here we kind of see why. You can sort of tell someone about the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, but you can't, to use a Christian analogy, there's no Buddhist corollary to like baptism. You can't be baptized by someone who's a Buddhist into Buddhism and then you're saved. It's all just you working hard on your own. Don't sacrifice your own welfare for that of another, no matter how great. Now here he doesn't mean don't like jump in front of a car to save somebody. He means don't abandon the Buddhist practice for someone else. Like we saw him not willing to abandon his practice for the sake of his wife and 2 kids in the story that we started this lecture with. Realizing your own true welfare, be intent on just that. And that's it. There we have it. So we've read some words of the Buddha. Let's think about them for just one more second. One last thing, and here we're really jumping off the deep end for most of you. This is just for the real ones out there. We had a sort of conflicting message that I would like to alert some of you more philosophically minded watching this to think about. We saw at the end of the passage on aging that, house builder, you are seen, you will not build that house again. And we said the house is traditionally understood to be the self. So you're ending the cycle of death and rebirth. You're ending the self. And yet as we move through the passage on self, what we slowly realized is that nothing is self. That what you actually have to do is overcome yourself. So Buddhism becomes a tradition in which you use the self, your desire, the one desire you're allowed to end suffering. You use that to slowly realize that there is no self. So you use the self to overcome, in the final moments, even the concept of the self. So the self has to destroy the self. And there you get nirvana, which again is not heaven. It is extinction. Now with that, let's turn to a little more political history before we round things out. So we open this unit talking about Ashoka and the Mauryan dynasty and Ashoka's importance as the major patron and perhaps sort of historical, savior's the wrong word, but the reason this religion and this way of thinking survives as opposed to others in history of Buddhism. So now that we know a little bit more about a sort of reading of, and in fairness, my reading's a little conservative. It's just based on the texts themselves, not the wide variety of religious practice. Now that we know a little bit about the ideas of Buddhism, let's go back and talk about Ashoka. So the Mauryan dynasty, the dynasty in which Ashoka was king, was actually founded by Ashoka's grandfather. It was the first large state in India, and Buddhism is at its peak for the time, not world historically, but at a peak during the time of the Mauryan dynasty, again because it appealed to a broad array of people, especially merchants who could donate to temples to make merit to improve their chances of being born in a better station in the next life. Around 320 BCE, Chandragupta Maurya, who reigned from 320 to 297, defeated all of his rivals to gain control of the city where he placed his capital, the capital even for Ashoka, Pataliputra. This city is located on the Ganges River, so we're way out. Those original Indo-Aryan people were benefiting from all of their Iron Age production and things like that we could have this capital out here. And it was a city large and important enough to house even an ambassador from Seleucus. Seleucus, a successor to Alexander the Great. We'll talk more in detail about that in a different unit. It was a city that occupied about 20 square miles. How did the political power work? Well, the rulers of the Mauryan dynasty had complete control inside the capital itself. If you're in the city, they control you. They controlled trade, they controlled merchants. And trade and merchants, as opposed to like a grain tax, taxes on income from trade and merchants, this was the main source of state revenue. Now, I said earlier that we had an ambassador from Seleucus, a successor to Alexander the Great. That ambassador is a gentleman named Megasthenes. And Megasthenes references many more castes, or Varna, if you'll recall, than were mentioned in the Rig Veda, but he confirms that no one can marry outside of these Varna or perform any work outside of what those Varna are allowed to do. And it's these castes that are operating, performing different tasks within the Mauryan capital over which Ashoka and his forebearers are ruling. Megasthenes writes a text called Indica, which describes 7, not 4, Varna active at the time. Who's right, who's wrong, 4, 7 Varna, how many? Not a question I'm interested in solving. It's sufficient to say that some system of Varna existed under Ashoka's rule. One final point that's changing around the time of the Mauryan dynasty is while the Buddha had said, you really shouldn't worship images of me, many Buddhists are beginning to revere the Buddha as a god himself and are in fact beginning to build statues like what you're accustomed to now if you Google search a Buddhist temple. Images, golden images often of the Buddha, at which or around which they do in fact worship. So I mentioned that the Mauryan dynasty had a lot of control inside its capital of Pataliputra, that their income, state revenue, came from taxing trade, merchants, things like that. What does it look like outside the city? Well, they had close supervision of rural areas around the capital, but not over all of North India. Power began to fade very quickly. Now, any state that hopes to survive has to make some kind of infrastructural investment. So the Mauryans went about building roads. They need roads. Their income is merchants. So they need those merchants to get from point A to point B to trade. So they're happy to build those roads to facilitate trade, which facilitates them being able to collect higher taxes. Fairly straightforward. And their power, even where it's faded in the rural countryside, along the road, their power stands. And it becomes a sort of interesting decentralized system. Local people in this dynasty continued to speak their own languages. You weren't compelled to speak one imperial language. Ashoka would send officials to inspect outlying regions. Are they following my dictates? Are they broadly living how I would want them to under my rule? But he only sent these people every 3 to 5 years, which is a wide berth to give these places. You really do what you want to do, rule how you want to rule, so long as sort of the taxes, but not called taxes because they're collected by temples, are sent to the state, but not called the state because they're sent to a main temple in the capital. It's such a weak dynasty, and this is the final sort of point to emphasize that Mauryan rulers did not even mint their own coins. Power is so decentralized, local rulers are in their own local place so powerful that it falls on the local rulers themselves to come up with coins. So the Mauryan dynasty, this one of few points in pre-modern Indian history where most of the subcontinent is united under one ruler, that one ruler's power so weak that he doesn't even establish a unified monetary system. Huh. If no monetary system, then how did this guy rule? What's going on? This guy's so weak. Well, he was, as I alluded to in the first of these 2 lectures in this module, what's called a Chakravartin. And this is going to be a very important concept for a while in China and a long, long time, even to today in some cases, in Southeast Asia. What that literally means, Chakravartin, is the turner of the wheel. It's a Buddhist term for the ideal ruler who rules through patronizing Buddhism but never actually becomes a monk. So he never ordains. He's a lay Buddhist. He doesn't have to follow all of the practices of Buddhism, but he supports Buddhism monetarily. He protects it militarily if it comes to that sort of thing. He ran then, this Chakravartin, our friend Ashoka, a ceremonial state. A state whose ruler sponsored religious observances and construction of religious edifices in the hope that his, or her if you prefer, subjects would willingly acknowledge this individual as a ruler. So you just become the best at your religion, the best rich person at practicing and sponsoring your religion, so much so that you become so good that people just start following you and obeying what it is that you say. Now, that's him after his conversion, but don't forget about those bloody military campaigns, the one in Kalinga so bloody that he had a come to Buddha moment. This was usually contrasted, this form of rule, with rulers who depended on sheer force to govern, which Ashoka flatly is not. He doesn't have enough force to do it. He is what we call a lay Buddhist. So he's a devotee who observes the 5 precepts of not killing, not stealing, don't commit adultery, don't lie, and don't drink alcohol, but continues to live at home and does not join the Buddhist order. So he follows some of the Buddhist rules for monkhood, but not all of them. What then is left to say? I would be remiss if I didn't at least make some comment on Indian Ocean trade. Indian Ocean trade in the pre-modern world is sort of the commercial superhighway. Everyone is trading across the Indian Ocean. When we get to Japan, Korea, most importantly economically, not culturally, China, how is Chinese silk getting anywhere? How are Chinese pottery getting anywhere? There is eventually the Silk Road, but overland trade is slow. The ocean is fast. So anyone who wants to trade into East Asia all the way into, the Arabian Peninsula and Africa is having to cross the Indian Ocean. India's connections to Western Asia were strong from the very beginning, from 2600 BCE forward. As Buddhism grew in importance under the Mauryan dynasty, it followed the trade routes that this kingdom, as I said, governed. It followed those roads, but it also followed those shipping paths. You had a choice of routes if you were a merchant. If you wanted to go overland during the Mauryan dynasty, you could move through the Hindu Kush in the northwest, which includes the Khyber Pass, which would give you contact to what is now Afghanistan. The most important route, however, as I've emphasized, was by sea. By 2200 BCE, mariners from South and Southeast Asia were already arriving regularly in Australia. By 100 CE, the monsoon winds were used as a powerful source to move sailboats around the Indian Ocean. These small boats, a sort of modern replica of one is pictured here, were called dhows, D-H-O-W-S. How do we know this? Don't boats fall apart? Natural reserves of that blue stuff from the previous lecture, lapis lazuli, only exist in Badakhshan, Afghanistan. This is in northern Afghanistan. So if you see lapis lazuli anywhere, you know that's a trade network that touched northern Afghanistan. This and carnelian are found across Mesopotamia, the Arabian Peninsula, and East Africa, these South Asian goods. That's quite a long way for them to travel. And again, I don't mean one merchant took them. I mean they followed a trade network. A Greek text called the Periplus, written by a merchant living in Egypt around 50 CE, describes the routes of Egyptian merchants by sea to India and India's major exports. He says India was exporting glass, grindstones, ceramics, and iron. These were all things you would find traded at these ports and moving along the sea. Although the author of Periplus thought China was a city, not a massive empire, and not in fact anything anyone should worry about, he still notes that silk from China can be found and purchased in India for sale back in the Mediterranean world. So again, 50 CE, the Indian Ocean is such a significant trade route that it's trafficking silk out of the east coast of China, around Southeast Asia through what's called the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, onto the Arabian Peninsula, from there perhaps to East Africa, up the Nile through what was Nubia, into Egypt, out the Nile Delta, perhaps onto the Levant where the Hebrew peoples are, perhaps up to what will become Lebanon, and then out from there across the Mediterranean into Europe. So it's a very, very connected world by 50 CE, a very interesting world. But that's all I've got for now. I will see you in the next lecture.